Hi, my name's Stephen. Today I'm going to show you how to repair a crack or a bubble in a lath and plaster wall. This house was built about 100 years ago, and that was before drywall became the norm, and they used lath and plaster. A lot of you may have houses like this, and might have problems like this. I'm going to show you how to repair this, or at least to stabilize the plaster for a repair. First thing we do is, of course, locate the crack. As you can see, if you follow my finger, there's a crack right here in the wall. And you might be able to see it, might not, but if you press on this, you can see that you can even hear the plaster moves. That means that the keys of the original plaster have broken off inside the lath, and it's no longer connected to the lath. And what we're going to do is reconnect it to that lath using glue. Okay, so we've identified the problem. The next step is to locate the studs. To do that, you'll need a deep scan stud sensor to go through the plaster. Regular stud sensor probably won't do the job. In this case, I've already done that step. So what I will do is I will mark the studs on the wall so I know where I'm going to be screwing to when I'm doing the anchoring part. So we have our lines here on the wall. The crack, I will highlight it just a little bit, runs down just like this. And what I'm going to take care of is the piece between these two studs. Now, the first step is not going to be necessary for everyone. In this case, I could probably re-anchor this plaster without taking any out. But I'm going to take some plaster out on either side of this crack, specifically to show the lath behind it and to possibly create another video showing how to fill in the event that somebody has a much worse crack than this. Okay, so if you have a crack and you do need to take some of it out, and you'll be able to tell that by basically how much the plaster is loose from the wall. In this case, it's fairly tight, but you can see a little bit of movement. So I'm going to go ahead and take this out. If you need to do that, you'll need a chisel and a hammer, and of course, appropriate safety gear. We start back a little ways from the crack, and you see how easily this collapses. You'll of course have a drop cloth, as I have here. The plaster is clearly fairly loose from the wall already. And because this stuff can be heavy and can scratch or scar a floor, make sure you have your drop cloth reasonably sturdy when you're doing that. We're going to just pause here. I'm going to go ahead and take this out, but there's no reason for you to have to watch all that. We'll be back. Okay, so as you can see, we've cleaned out a little bit of plaster here. The individual laths are visible. I've gone through and knocked the little bits of keyway back out through, or the keys out through the keyway, and took a shot back and cleaned this up nicely. And as you can see here on the wall, I've marked where the lath is behind the plaster. This is important because this is where we want to make our screw holes right on top of the lath. So, with no further ado, I found that a 3/8 inch masonry bit seems to be about the right size for this project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start down here at the bottom, a little ways away from the actual crack, and just do a hole straight into the wall. And I only want to go down until it hits the lath. I don't want to go through the lath because that's what's going to hold the wall together. And we'll pause here while I do the rest of this. There's no reason for you to have to watch it all.
Go for it.
As you can see, I've taken these back 1.5 inches or so from the edge of the plaster because this is fairly fragile plaster throughout here. And if you get much closer to the edge than that, it is likely to break. If it does, you just clean out another spot and move over a little bit. You've got to be careful doing that or you might wind up doing the whole wall. So, as you can see, we started over here and I've worked all the way around the crack and even made a couple of mistakes. What we're going to do now, after I've also vacuumed out each of these holes with the shop vac to get all of the dust out of them. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take some construction adhesive and a caulk gun and cut the tip to fit just about exactly into these holes. Take a paper towel and wrap around it and stick it into the hole and then inject it in. I'm going to start at the top because gravity works. Now what I'm doing is I'm squirting enough construction adhesive in that it spreads out in the space between the plaster and the lath back in here. And that is going to dry and form a bond. And I'm going to go ahead and finish these holes and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, now you're going to see here how this sometimes works. When you squirt the adhesive into the hole, it will begin to fill the hole below it, and sometimes the hole above it, and sometimes you get an overflow. And we may actually wind up needing more adhesive than we have, but this is going to set up and hold this wall together very nicely. And you can see we're getting some push out clear over the edge, and we're out of adhesive. As you can see, all of the holes have now had construction adhesive squeezed into them. Some of it has even squeezed out into our original crack here. That's excellent. That tells me that the adhesive is back behind the plaster, in between the lath and the plaster, which is exactly what we wanted. Now I'm going to take a piece of plywood that just about exactly covers this. We're going to set it over the structure this way. Then we will take 2x4 pieces. I already have screws started, as you can see. The screws are going to go into the studs, nearest to the crack in the wall. And as the screws pull the 2x toward the studs, it will press the plywood up against the plaster, pushing it in turn up against the lath. Before we put the plywood up for good, though, as you can see, it's got some little bits of adhesive on it. So before we do that, we'll use some wax paper. The wax paper will go on the plywood, between the plywood and the wall, so that when the construction adhesive does squeeze out the holes, which it will have something that's not sticky. And when we decide to take this down after the adhesive is hardened, it'll just come right off the wall. So our next step is to go ahead and start this. Okay. Generally the wax paper will stick against the wall on its own for just a moment. That gives me time to get my plywood up in place and get my first brace started. As you can see, the plywood is pulled tightly against the wall at the top, and when we put the next brace across the bottom, it will pull the bottom up tight. As you can see, I cut holes here and here. The reason for that is I want the screws to go past the plywood into the stud and not through the plywood, so that they're not pulling the plywood against these braces. That helps, that causes it to be a little bit tighter fit. Good and solid. And that is all we have to do at this point in time. The next part of the game is to wait. When the construction adhesive is hardened, which varies depending on the adhesive, we just take this back off of the wall, and then you're ready to actually begin the patching procedure. One caveat that I would throw out there is that when you're using the adhesive in between wall structure like this, it takes substantially longer than it usually says on the tube. I would give it probably 2 or 3 times as much time. Now we're ready to go ahead and take these off and see how it worked out. This is 2 days later, and as you can see, the adhesive is still a little bit soft, so it is sufficiently tight that we can open it up to the air and let the rest of it cure. But this is what your product will look like, and after this stage, it's just a matter of filling with plaster, taping, and texturing. We'll cover that sometime else. Thank you.